Starting over. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Issues of acceptance and equality are frequently in the headlines in the workplace. Communicating values of respect and inclusion while creating a safe and welcoming environment for employees of all gender identities and expressions is imperative. As more transgender individuals join the workforce or transition at work, managers, supervisors, HR professionals, leaders, and others must consider issues of transphobia, bathroom access, harassment, discrimination, abuse, and more. How we support transgender employees will help determine their success and ours, particularly in attracting, retaining, and promoting top talent. Join us in the observance of Transgender Awareness Week as we welcome Lydia E. Lavelle, an American academic, politician, attorney, author, as she dissects this topic and highlights the legal ramifications of avoiding and failing to properly manage these issues. Before we go further into today's program, I would like to do some housekeeping. As always, keep your microphones on mute throughout the entire presentation. Please send all of your questions to the chat room. The chat room will be monitored, and we will work to make sure all of your questions are answered in an orderly fashion. Today's speaker will also be taking questions during their presentation from the chat room. So please, again, present your questions to the chat function. This session will be recorded, and you will be able to view this program later on demand. Speaking of on-demand recordings, you will be notified soon of this program's availability and all of our recent programs when they are ready to be viewed. Today's session will conclude this year's EEO Officer Lunch and Learn series. Stay tuned for the 2023 series events. I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague here at OSHR, Lisa Coffey, and she is going to introduce our guest speaker. Lisa?
Thank you, Wendy. Professor Lydia Lavelle, born in Athens, Ohio, graduated with a BA from St. Andrews University, earned a Master's of Recreation Resources from the North Carolina State University, and worked in the field of parks and recreation administration for several years. She is a graduate of North Carolina Central University Law School and clerk for the Honorable Clifton E. Johnson on the North Carolina Court of Appeals before obtaining a position at North Carolina Central University School of Law. Professor Lavelle was also the law school's first pro bono coordinator and alumni relations director, and served as the assistant dean of student affairs at the law school. She teaches civil procedure, state and local governmental law, and sexual identity and the law. She has taught legal writing 2, advanced legal writing 1, and street law, and served as a chair of the member of the law school's curriculum committee, relations and external affairs committee, and student disciplinary committee. Her memberships include the 18th Judicial District Bar, the North Carolina Bar Association, the American Bar Association, the North Carolina Association of Women Attorneys, the National Lesbian and Gay Law Bar Association, and the North Carolina Gay and Lesbian Attorneys. She is a past president of NCAWA and is licensed to practice law in both North Carolina and Ohio. In 2018, Professor Lavelle was appointed to Governor Roy Cooper's Commission on Inclusion. She has been involved in public service for many years, including nearly a decade as a member of the Durham Open Space and Trails Commission. After being elected to 2 terms on the Carborough Board of Aldermen, now Council, she served as mayor for 4 terms from 2013 to 2021. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Lydia Lavelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you here today to talk about transgender awareness. Quick shout out to Tracy Jones. Judge Clifton is my cousin. I clerk for Judge Clifton Johnson, and I want to say hello to any legal eagles who might be out there. I'm going to go to a slide here that's going to cover, these are the different topics I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk very briefly about myself, why I have an interest in LGBTQ plus issues. We're going to go over some terms. We're going to go through a little bit of history. I'm going to share some statistics with you. And then we're going to talk about challenges that transgender people face. I'm going to give you some legal updates. And then we'll close out by talking about how to be supportive and proactive around transgender issues. Okay. So just a little bit about me. So this area of LGBTQ advocacy affects me in three broad spheres. So one is, you know, most importantly, really my family. I'm married to my wife, Alicia. That's a picture of our family down there. We have two kids and we have a son-in-law on the far left. So a lot of the scholarship I do obviously affects me and my family very personally. And so it's really interesting in that respect. Secondly, as a professor here at North Carolina Central University School of Law, this is where I have developed my scholarship. It's been an amazing time to be a law professor and to be following all the legal developments around these issues. And so as a academician, I like talking to our students and making sure they're about all of these issues and making sure they understand all the legal nuances around this. And then lastly, when I was mayor of Carborough as a local elected official, I felt a real responsibility to our community, our LGBTQ community, to do whatever I could at the local level to help us and to help protect us, advance us. And I worked with, you know, mayors and elected officials across the state when I was in that capacity. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's move on here then to terms. So what is your, we're going to start out here talking just generally first about your definition of transgender, and then I'm going to go through several different like terms related to sexuality and gender. So I'd like for you to put this in the chat. What is your definition of transgender? I'm seeing some different kind of, identifying as the opposite gender of what you were born as, a person who is a different gender than the one that you're assigned at birth. Yep, someone who identifies as a gender other than the one assigned to them at birth. And that's a good descriptor of what it is to be transgender. I want to talk to you about just a lot of different terms that we need to be familiar with, that we need to know about, okay? And I want to share a good resource with you. This is the GLAAD website. GLAAD is like Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, but this is a really good document and source for you to go to if you want to learn more about terms and just kind of the do's and don'ts around terms. So let me just give you some examples of some definitions, right? And you probably know a lot of these, but so lesbian, a woman who's attracted to other women. Gay is an adjective used to describe a person whose attractions are to people of the same sex. So, you know, like gay men, gay women, you know, gay people. Bisexual is a person who has the potential to be attracted to people of more than one gender, okay? Not necessarily at the same time or in the same way or to the same degree. And then again, transgender, an adjective to describe people whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth, and this is independent of sexual orientation, okay? And then the word queer, right? So queer is not exclusively heterosexual, right? And it's kind of a term younger folks use a lot too. Typically for those who identify as queer, the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual are perceived to be too limiting or just fraught with cultural connotations, I guess. And you know, this word used to be a pejorative term, right? But it's been reclaimed by some LGBTQ folks now to describe themselves, okay? Sometimes we see other letters, LGBTQIA+, right? And Those might go on to refer to inquiring, asexual, intersex, allies. GLAAD also has a dictionary, a glossary, if you will, of also just transgender type terms also, okay? This glossary defines other terms, such as sex at birth, gender identity, gender expression, gender nonconforming, sexual orientation, cisgender, transgender, trans, transition, transgender man, transgender woman, non-binary people, drag performance. I commend this glossary to you because it's really good. It's really detailed. It also lists terms that are outdated and that should generally not be used, like transsexual, cross-dresser, even gender confirmation surgery. But one term that should definitely always be avoided is a transgender or transgenders. Okay, in other words, the term transgender is an adjective, not a noun. Okay. All right, and so if you want to know more about this, learn more about this, here's a good resource. Two of them actually here. This first one, A Brief History of the LGBTQ Initialization. So that's kind of an interesting article. The second one about the evolving recognition of identity. It's actually a National Geographic article that I believe is from last year or the year before, but it was really good. And it talks about not even so much initials, but just identity in general. And it's a really good one as well. Okay. So now we're going to talk about history of it. Okay. And just in the way of addressing this before I show you some photos, people who are gay and lesbian and dressing and living differently than their sex assigned at birth have existed throughout history, right? In the United States, we actually have documented cases since the early 1600s. And sometimes folks were identified as intersex, right? And intersex is an adjective that's used to describe someone who has one or more innate sexual characteristics. They might have, like, for example, genitals, reproductive organs, chromosomes that fall outside of traditional conceptions of male or female bodies. All right. So here are some photos I found from over the past 170 years or so that depict our community here throughout the years. Let me just share some of these with you. These are kind of cool. That's Marsha P. Johnson there. All right, so what is one historical event that you can associate with the LGBTQ movement? And I'm combining this together because in many places the movements intersect. The movements for the ability to live, freely, sexually, gender-wise, whatever, they kind of ran together for many, many years and still do, right? But let's see, what are historical events? So I see some answers here. Let's see. Legalization of gay marriage in 2015. Yep. The Pulse nightclub, that was a horrific event a few years ago at a Latinx club in Florida where a lot of folks were murdered. Violence against the community. I'll get to a little bit of that later in this. Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's definitely an event associated with our movement. HB2, I'm going to talk about that a little. Obergefell, that's the case that we got marriage equality from. Okay, so these are a lot of good examples here of, and I guess the very first one I think I had was Stonewall, right? So Stonewall is really what a lot of people think about as the visible, I guess, start of the LGBTQ gay rights movement. That was in 1969, a bar in Greenwich Village in New York City when people, and there were gay and lesbian and transgender folks there, pushed back and said enough is enough. We recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. But, through the years, Stonewall, and then lots of this legislation, a lot of court cases, the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, in the 90s, as we heard, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then we had, some emergence of some public figures and so on. And then a lot of the advances we've seen in the 2000s, military, etc., right? But I want to talk about just a couple of quick ones here related to transgender history. There were a couple of other riots and demonstrations even before Stonewall. There's a little, that's me going through the timeline. So this is a slide talking about Compton's cafeteria riot. This was in 1966. There were a couple of other riots even in the years before this, but you know, some of these memories and events are lost to history, the details. But this one was one where it was a recorded transgender riot, took place in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, and it's called the Compton's Cafeteria Riot. And there are clips about this out there on you know, YouTube, the internet, and so forth, if you want to read see a little bit more about it. But this was a pushback we don't hear as much about when we hear about Stonewall, right? And it's been marked historically in San Francisco. And in fact, I want to say maybe they even have a transgender cultural arts district they have kind of used to kind of surround this area. So in any event, what I'm saying is, as the movements began, there were several different demonstrations and riots happening in the 50s and 60s that led to this movement really taking forward. Now, in the 70s and 80s, we actually started to see a conflict between the gay rights movement and the transgender movement. You know, the battle for acceptance for everyone was far from won, and so some of the advocacy groups were also springing up in the 50s. But we saw some of the advocacy groups, some of the first transgender groups dissolve. We saw gay groups, some feminist groups distance themselves from the transgender community. Another kind of important medical timeline to kind of think of through these years was the continuing evolution of the DSM. That's the manual that explains you know, the medical conditions related to disorders, and the evolution of the DSM in terms of how it addressed transgender folks, okay? Like the first two editions of the DSM in 1952 and 1968 contained no mention of gender identity, okay? In the DSM-3, which was in 1980, the diagnosis of transsexualism first appeared, right? And in fact, the World Health Organization followed suit and included that diagnosis. But the DSM-4 in 1994, they got rid of the term transsexualism. They replaced it with gender identity disorder in adults and adolescents, okay, to reduce stigma, right? But in any event, the medical community has been in a state of I don't want to say disagreement, but disagreement or whatever about how actually to categorize this. And then in the DSM-5, which was in 2013, the 5th edition, the DSM-5, this eliminated gender identity disorder and replaced it with gender dysphoria, okay? Articulating that gender nonconformity is not in itself a mental disorder, and also, again, having a separate gender dysphoria in children. And so having a little more progressive, up-to-date understanding, if you will, of the transgender community. But for instance, discussion still continues among advocates and medical professionals about how best to preserve access to gender transition-related health care, but also trying to minimize the degree to which such diagnostic categories stigmatize the very people that physicians are attempting to help. In some cases, this is necessary for, you know, for medical services, for health insurance, right? But there is, in the International Classification of Diseases by the World Health Organization that is currently in use, there is no entry for gender dysphoria in the mental health section. And the United States is expected to adopt that in 2025. So it continues to evolve in the DSM. Okay, so continuing with history though, as with gay and lesbian people, we started to have more and more people in the public life kind of coming out as transgender. And here are some examples of some of these folks. Of course, we have Chaz Bono, and Cher's son, and Laverne Cox. And then we have Elliot Page, the actor. And then at the bottom here, we have a couple of folks. Delegate Donica Rome, she is a member of the House of Delegates, Virginia's House of Delegates. She's been elected a couple of times to their statewide office. And then here we have Dr. Rachel Levine, and she serves as the United States Assistant Secretary for Health, and she was appointed under President Biden. So again, we're seeing again more in arts and entertainment and in pop culture and elsewhere. We're starting to see visible folks that are transgender. At the same time, we've seen some documentation by the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, of violence against folks that are transgender. Now, as this slide indicates, they have been tracking this since 2013. And as it notes here, these numbers are disproportionately against women of color, okay? And down below on the slide here, I put the transgender pride flag, which I think is fitting for this. But these statistics about the people who are known, transgender folks who are known to have been fatally shot or killed by other violent means, we know the number is much higher than this, right? But these are ones that HRC is aware of, been identified to them, and they try to list each of these people and a little bit about them on their website each year. And so I want you to listen to how this number has increased over time. In 2015, 21 people. 2016, 21. 2017, 25. 2018, 22. 2019, 25. 2020, 37. 2021, 57. And so you kind of see how these years correlate with, politics that's been going on, and also some other things like the introduction of legislation in different state legislatures. But in any event, it's clear that these cases involve anti-transgender bias, and in most of them. And HRC says in those that didn't, their transgender status may have put them at risk in other ways, like forcing them into homelessness. And then we also look at just the intersectionality of transgender folks. It disproportionately, as I said, affects transgender women of color. But then you pull in this intersection of racism and sexism and classism and homophobia, transphobia, and it really it makes these folks very, very vulnerable. And as a result, one of the responses to this disturbing trend has been awareness. Events such as Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is on November 20th, and Transgender Awareness Week, such as what we have going on here this week, to highlight these tragedies, show what services and support are available. And so workplaces like the North Carolina Department of Human Resources started highlighting transgender issues during the month of November. Okay, so where are we today with public perception around issues affecting the transgender community? So more statistics. So here's our first, and these are all Gallup polls, and I know it's hard for you to see this, but I'm going to go ahead and summarize each of these for you. Okay, so the first one at the top, Americans who say they personally know someone who is transgender. And these polls were taken last year, so May of 2021. Okay, so first of all, about 3 in 10 Americans, about 31%, report having a friend, relative, or colleague who is transgender. About half of adults younger than 30 have a transgender person in their life, but the rate falls with each older age cohort. Okay, adults age 65 and older are the least likely to know a transgender person, 19%. Okay. All right, and then at the bottom here, the second one, U.S. support for transgender persons serving in the military, and this actually is comparing 2019 to 2021. And so this poll was taking place around the time that President Biden had reversed President Trump's ban against transgender folks in the military. But in any event, both groups, it's kind of unchanged from 2019 to 2021. But both groups, both years, basically support the right of transgender folks to serve in the military. Okay, all groups kind of maintain majority levels of support. Again, younger folks more in favor under 50 than folks older 50. Women more in favor than men's. Depending on your political party, self-declared liberals more in favor than others. But in any event, the support is largely, it's kind of similar to past support for gays and lesbians in the military, which ranged a lot of this before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. All right, and then the next slide, the next Gallup slide, U.S. views on transgender athlete policies in sports, okay? Now, again, this is from last May 2021. A solid majority of Americans favor restrictions on transgender athletes' ability to play on teams that correspond with their gender identity. And as you'll hear later, this issue is being debated in dozens of state legislatures. A majority of Americans, 62%, say trans athletes should only be allowed to play on teams that correspond with their birth gender. 34% say they should be able to play on teams that match their gender identity. This varies around, the numbers vary around party, gender, and age subgroups. In general, Democrats, 55% express majority support for playing on teams that match their gender identity. And here's our third Gallup poll. The third one, this is Americans' views on the moral acceptancy of changing one's gender. Okay, and so yeah, Gallup kind of does this. They track Americans' views on a variety of moral issues. They've done it for many, many years. For example, abortion, birth control, those kind of things. And so this is related to, is it moral to change your gender, right? And so, well, first of all, Gallup's most recent polls show that 6% of U.S. adults, 0.6% of U.S. adults identify as being transgender. So changing one's gender identity is sharply contentious among all Americans. It's a few more, like 51% say morally wrong, morally acceptable, 49%. And again, though, varies by gender, age, and political ideology. Women more likely than men to view switching genders as morally acceptable. Younger adults more likely than older adults. Again, politically liberal, acceptable from a moral viewpoint, and so forth. All right, a few more statistics I want to show you, talk to you about. So these next two slides are from the from GLSEN, and so this is the Gay Lesbian School Education Network. Okay, and so this is double check something here. Okay, so I have the whole report, and I'm going to share a little bit with you about this. And this report is done every 2 years, and I think they've done it since maybe about 10 years or so now. And they go in, they get data on middle school students, high school students, around a variety of issues related to schools. Okay, for instance, they look, at how schools are, around safety, around anti-LGBTQ remarks, harassment and assault at school, discriminatory school policies and practices, victimization, are there supports at the schools, that kind of thing. And so I just want to share with you just a few of the findings from this that I think are interesting. So in general, and here's the thing, middle school and high school, it's not a fun place for a lot of kids anyway. But the data certainly bears out that it's harder if you're gay or lesbian, and harder than that if you're trans, okay? A couple of I'll throw out a couple of things to you. Most LGBTQ students reported, like 60% reported personally experiencing, LGBTQ related discriminatory policies or practices at school. So specific to their identity, prevented from using bathrooms aligned with their gender identity, 28%, disciplined for public displays of affection that were not similarly disciplined among non-LGBTQ students, 28%. Prevented from using the locker room aligned with their gender identity, 27%. Prevented from using chosen names, pronouns, 22%. Prevented from wearing clothes considered inappropriate based on their gender, 18%. Prohibited from discussing or writing about LGBTQ topics in school assignments, 16%. Prohibited from including LGBTQ topics in school extracurricular activities, 16%. Restricted from forming or promoting GSAs, that's a Gay Straight Alliance, 14%. Prohibited from wearing clothing or items supporting LGBTQ issues, 10.7%. Prevented or discouraged from playing in sports or attending dances or functions, or disciplined for identifying as LGBTQ. So just the identity makes it hard. Other things, harder in middle school than high school for LGBTQ kids. Harder in rural schools than urban schools. Harder in public schools than private non-religious schools. Private non-religious schools are the most accepting. Private religious schools, still not great. Public schools, not great. Okay, so just in general, and also really important to have someone at the school that is known to be an ally or to have some support at the school, supportive staff, supportive faculty, whatever. And fortunately, most of the statistics kind of bear out that most schools have at least someone at the school, if not many people at the school that students feel like they can talk to. So I have my next slide just kind of illustrates this a little bit more. This is the overall most recent kind of summary. Schools are essentially hostile places for LGBTQ students, and homophobic negative remarks about gender expression from teachers and staff increased from 19 to 2021. In general, since 2013, things have been getting really good. But over the last 2 years, some of the climate, particularly with regard to the adults at the schools, has gone up in a bad way. 52% of kids LGBTQ considered dropping out. They had reported a hostile school climate, and 72% said, no topics in any classes. That, of course, is a recent hot topic in discussions around school curriculum right now. Okay. Now, in the next slide, what are some challenges facing transgender people? Okay. And so here is where I look for a few answers here from folks. Let's see, acceptance from family members, navigating the world safely. Yep, surviving to adulthood, kind of like I just talked about with the schools. Explaining being transgender to your children, right, or to your family members. Yeah, changing your name, changing your gender, like how do you legally go about doing that? Access to voting. Access to voting, because a lot of these laws now you have to have an ID to be able to vote, and that can be problematic if you don't match your picture or your name or the gender on your license. Sex ed, so we talked just a little bit about that. What the curriculum covers in school, and a lot of times it's very devoid of anything that gay or lesbian or transgender kids face. Family disowning you. I mean, sometimes you make the choice. You don't make the choice. Sometimes you have to choose between yourself or your family. Yeah, those are all good ones. So here are some that I listed. A lot of you said several of them that I said. So obtaining correct identity documents, and this is a big deal when you think about it. Think about all of the things you use your. You think that I'm sorry, I was reading a question. You think about all the things you have to show your documents to do, even to be employed, right? You have to show a couple of different documents, or as someone said, to vote. We see that later on in the list, right? So different ways you use identification going out of the country, right? So that's one. Participating in sports, huge, big deal right now. We're going to talk a little bit about, basically kind of high schools right now, but it's an issue at every level, right? From my friend whose daughter wanted to play Little League softball to, folks trying to participate in the Olympics. So this is like a really big issue. Restrooms, locker rooms, we've heard a lot around this, right? Health insurance is a huge one. Is the health insurance one has, does it cover different types of surgery, different kinds of hormone treatments? So that's huge. Just privacy in general, right? Privacy, like wanting to keep this private and in some cases, right? And being outed sometimes when you may not want to be. I know I have another friend who has a daughter who got outed by her teachers, and they didn't necessarily want that. Discrimination. I'm going to talk a little bit about employment discrimination in a few minutes. Harassment, bullying, violence. Just talked about some of that in terms of young people, but it certainly happens at every age. But also we go to examples like Matthew Shepard, for instance. Homelessness. Folks who are transgender and homeless, and you're dealing with, maybe homeless shelters or access to services, and it gets hard and complicated. Jail and prison, I have a typo there, I'll change that. But yeah, and this is a whole nother area too, when you have someone who's transgender and maybe your officials who are working with those folks to have them in their facilities haven't thought through how best to accommodate different folks. Voting is big, because we know, especially with the way legislation is going lately, to require IDs in a lot of states, that if you have an ID that doesn't match, who you are or what you look like, that can be a problem. Aging, what happens to any folk when they get older, right? But then the additional complication, perhaps of other issues when you're transgender. And then religious exemption challenges. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit with regard to some cases that the court is going to be talking about. Let me talk for just a minute about employment discrimination statistics. And so this is a report that I have from what's called the Williams Report. And this is the Williams Institute out of UCLA does a lot of really great policy work around LGBTQ issues. And they came out with a report recently about LGBT people's experiences around workplace discrimination and harassment. And this one is based on over the last year, okay? And not really surprising findings in this report, but it's been given in light of a case that the Supreme Court decided called Bostock, which I'll talk about briefly, which might make it seem that employment discrimination might not be so overt as it has been. But in any event, this report, and again, I'm focusing on a lot of the statistics and surveys, et cetera, around folks that are around trans folks rather than gay and lesbian folks, just because of the emphasis of this presentation. But a lot of what I'm talking about applies across the board to sexual minorities. But their analysis indicates employment discrimination against LGBT people continues to be persistent and widespread, okay? Over 40% of LGBT workers reported experiencing unfair treatment at work. It's ongoing. And a lot of the folks, when they say, why do they think they were being discriminated against? They felt it was motivated by religious beliefs. And we've heard that, right? And even as much as gay and lesbian bisexual employees experienced discrimination, transgender employees were more likely to experience discrimination based on their status. So nearly half of transgender employees reported experiencing discrimination, either being fired or not hired based on their status, compared to cisgender gay, lesbian, bisexual employees. And other unfair treatment reported by these respondents not being promoted, not receiving raises, being treated differently than those with different sex partners, having their schedules change, being excluded from company events. Again, let's see, there's one more. And also this idea of covering. And this is like a word that kind of means, you kind of hide. You kind of hide who you are. You hide your sexuality, or you hide your, gender, perhaps. Many LGBT employees report engaging in covering to avoid harassment or discrimination at work, including changing their physical appearance, how often they use the restroom, avoiding talking about their families or friends or social lives. Some do it because their supervisors or coworkers told them to do so. And again, as much as gay and lesbian folks do this, transgender employees were statistically more likely to engage in this type of behavior than others. And so those are just kind of some type of employment discrimination stats I wanted to be sure to bring up. Now, I want to talk about these recent kind of bills that have been kind of introduced across the country. And for this, I want to talk a little bit. There was an article in the Washington Post last month that kind of summarized these bills. And what I want to do here is, first of all, show you over the years. So what I call these are, I'll call these like anti-transgender bills, because these are bills being introduced in state legislatures across the country to reduce rights for transgender folks, or to kind of create some type of restrictions. Okay, so in 2018, across the country, there were about 19 bills. In 19, there were 25 bills. In 2020, there were 60 bills. In 2021, there were 131 bills, and in 2022, 155 bills. So this past year, there were 155 bills introduced to kind of restrict rights for transgender folks. And this next slide kind of shows us, so over the last 5 years or so, we've had 390 bills that have been introduced. Now, the good news is only 39 of these have been passed. Okay, so there is a consensus that some of these bills are just really outrageous. Okay, but let me tell you about some of the bills that we have seen. Okay, so a lot of the bills, just globally, they aim at preventing trans girls and women from playing on sports teams. They often bar trans youth from using bathrooms and locker rooms that align with the gender identity. And really, some of them that are the most horrific have restrictions on gender-affirming medical care. And so a couple of quick stats I want to tell you about this. And honestly, this article, it kind of puts the genesis of a lot of these bills back to HB2 in North Carolina. Okay, the current wave of legislation seeking to restrict the rights of transgender people began around 2016 with North Carolina's bathroom bill. Okay, and so that was the bill we had in North Carolina, which we no longer have, which was, kind of involved policing people, like telling folks they had to use the restroom of the sex they were assigned with at birth. So in any event, that's part of, over the last several years, we've seen this trend. Some of it also is a reaction to this, this Bostock United States Supreme Court case that I referred to. In 2020, United States Supreme Court held in a case that federal law that barred employment discrimination, traditionally around, race and age and other things, also applied in terms of sex to sexual orientation and gender identity. It was a really, really big, great case for the LGBTQ community. And so some of these are kind of seen as some backlash to that. But again, good news is that of all these bills introduced, only 39 have become law. The general broad areas these bills are around are sports bills, educational restrictions, and some of you have talked about these, like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, right? ID restrictions, okay? Some have moved to restrict folks from aligning, correcting their ID, like the documents we talked about, right? Some around religious stuff, and then healthcare restrictions are a biggie. And these are ones that are really kind of the most alarming. Gender affirming care restrictions for trans youth, and then also punishing parents for supporting their kids as they seek treatment. And so those are, Arkansas, Alabama, Arizona, a few states have passed those. Okay. Now, the good news is, so here's where our anti-trans laws have passed since 2018. The more purple, the worse. The oranger, the lower. White is the best. And this is totally typical. The East and the West Coast are usually, you don't see these, but you see a lot in the South, right? So these are anti-trans laws passed. Now, alternatively, though, we do see, this is a map that kind of shows everything, including where trans protections are being strengthened. And so here, again, the majority of these bills have not passed. And there are a lot of states some states have created kind of refuge laws that protect trans folks. Others have passed laws that explicitly require insurance carriers to cover gender affirming care procedures. Some, like Virginia and New York, have anti-discrimination laws that are very broad. But in any event, there are states like moving in the opposite direction, which is good. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap this up here because we're getting kind of close. Let me jump ahead here so I want to talk briefly about this. So here are recent legal developments. And so in North Carolina, of course, I already mentioned we had this bill in 2016 that has now been repealed, where local communities were not allowed to pass public accommodation and employment non-discrimination bills at the local level until the end of 2020. So in 2021, several cities, including Carborough, Chapel Hill, a lot across the state have started to pass at the local level non-discrimination ordinances. So that's a good thing that's happened. Another development is that when Dale Falwell became the treasurer, the North Carolina state treasurer, under Janet Cow, transgender folks were covered under the state health plan. When Commissioner Falwell was elected, they were no longer allowed to be covered under the health care plan, and an action was brought against the treasurer's office. And this suit, Cato versus Falwell, in that case, the trial judge ruled that the health plan was discriminating against these employees by not including this, and so they reinstituted that coverage. Okay, in the United States, we have President Biden, who has done a lot since being elected. Most recently, even this year, for example, you even have an X gender marker option to get your federal IDs. Homeland Security has announced reforms to address barriers. HUD has also kind of restored key protections. Social Security Administration is phasing out gender identity verification later this year. The American Community Survey is going to start including data around folks around gender identity. But anything by executive order that a president can do, we see done, like with this administration with President Biden. In fact, undoing some of what was done during President Trump's administration. Down below, again, Bostock, I talked about that. Historically, gay people, LGBTQ people weren't covered under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Now they are on the basis of that case. And then finally, 303 Creative this is a case that's being argued on December 5th, 2022. And so this is a really important case affecting our community. So this was the Masterpiece case. This was Jack. He was the cake baker in that case. Down below here we have the person in 303 Creative. Her name is Lori Smith. And so the essence of these cases are, can a person who's operating in the public sphere, in public, on the public square, if you will, can they deny services to a person who's gay, lesbian, or transgender based on their religious belief? So for example, Jack Phillips on the top there, he did not want to bake a cake for a same-sex couple to help them celebrate their wedding, right? In that case, got settled on another issue, but he also does not want to bake a cake for someone who wants it to celebrate their gender transition. At the bottom, this case is about a person who wants to create a website that couples who are straight couples can use to design their wedding websites, but she does not want to have same-sex couples use her wedding website based on her strongly held religious belief. Again, Supreme Court's going to hear that in December. Be interesting to see how they go with that. But it's this conflict between religious freedom and public accommodation laws. This, anyway, so it's real interesting that's going on. All right, last couple of slides. Don't answer this. I'll just go ahead and give you some of my ideas. How can we be supportive of transgender colleagues at work? Now, with the state of North Carolina, I know we have some restrictions. We don't get to do maybe everything we would want to do, or a lot of this is set for us, but still there's a lot we can do with the state of North Carolina. But we also, a lot of us work part-time. A lot of us are on boards. We serve on boards, or we volunteer with boards, or on groups or organizations. So how can we be supportive of our transgender colleagues? And so here's some ways I thought of just generally. And someone mentioned this earlier: understand the correct terminology to use. Use a person's correct pronouns. Consider including yours in your signature. And on the next slide, I have a little link to that. If you don't know what pronouns someone prefers, ask. If you misgender, ask. I have usually found that people are willing to talk about how they want to be addressed, and they don't mind correcting. Try to degender things where possible. If you have a policy or rules or laws or ordinances or whatever that say he, she, male, female, or whatever, take out the use of genders. Consider possible changes to your restrooms or locker rooms. Be aware of possible health insurance issues. Be on the lookout for signs of discrimination, especially as an ally. Look out for harassment, bullying, violence. Speak up if you can. Talk and listen to kids. Be engaged and talk to family members, friends, etc. about these issues, and stay informed, okay? And then this is what I was talking about. These are a couple of good resources because people sometimes are like, well, what's the deal with pronouns? Well, it affirms the person's identity and shows basic respect if you use their correct pronouns. And also it's a show of solidarity if you include pronouns on your signature. And it helps. And it also helps, like, if you have a pronoun you want to be used and you have perhaps a first name where someone can't figure out, what your pronoun is if you have a certain pronoun, okay? So in any event, that is that. And then let me just say this. What did you learn during this presentation that you did not know? And I think that this is a great quote. I've learned I still have a lot to learn. And every time I prepare for one of these kind of conversations or presentations, I'm just reminded of how very much more we need to learn and listen and respect and get engaged about these issues. So this is the end of my presentation. And so I'm happy to answer any questions here we have. I think we have about maybe 8 or 9 minutes left. Wendy, Lisa, whatever we want to do now.
Okay, well, I've enjoyed your presentation, and I don't know if you've seen it yet, Lydia. I do have one question that I've already posted to your personal chat, so you can review that. Now I'll be ready to answer that first question. But we are taking questions now from the chat. So please submit your questions to the chat.
And
Okay.
let's see. Yeah, I'm having a little trouble finding it, Wendy. Give me just a minute here to.
I'll submit it to you again if you need me to.
That would be great. There's a lot going on here that. Okay. All right. Let's see. Here's one. Okay. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So I did get a question here about the how how do folks who work for the state of North Carolina, how do they respond to, for instance, I just told you about the Folwell decision, right? So how do we get word out to folks or make it more visible that there's this coverage now available where perhaps it wasn't available in the past? And so I think that's a good question. There's nothing, I guess, posted or available yet on your websites. So I would imagine, I know, I mean, I work for the state of North Carolina, the university system. I know we get a lot of information every year about that. So I guess I would just, whenever there's any kind of changes. So I guess I'll just kind of throw that out to anyone who may be watching or anyone who works with HR with the state to make sure that the folks who work for the state of North Carolina who are transgender are aware of this, that ruling did come down and that access to this under the policy is now available. Because you're right. I mean, sometimes we make these really good advances and then people don't know about it, or prospective employees might want to know about it. Current employees might want to know about it. Current employees might want to know about it for their kids. So if there's a way to make sure that something's out there and the details around it. I know with this, when I worked for the town of Carborough, we had to work this was several years ago, we had to work with our insurance provider very specifically to say, we want a policy that's as inclusive as it can be, and then we made sure that, of course, our employees, as they did their yearly kind of re-signing up for their benefits, that they were aware that we did have that. So I think that that's important to make sure folks know. Let's see if there's any other questions. Let's see. What are my, this is a good one. What are my thoughts on performance advantages for trans folks, trans women participating in sports? Yeah, this is really, this really cuts to the heart of it, to this issue, right? Because cisgender women have all kinds of, I'm 5'4". I wish I could play for the NBA, right? We have all kinds of heights and weights and deficiencies, and some of us are great athletes and some of us are terrible athletes. And so then the question is, if you're a trans woman, is being a trans woman, is that enough to catapult you into, oh, you shouldn't be able to play sports? And so that's a lot of the argument around it, I think, is, and the Olympics, when they've kind of tried to analyze this, they have looked at things like, testosterone level but ironically, in some instances, if you look at testosterone level, that might even actually eliminate a person who was cisgender, who always identified as a woman all her life, might have higher testosterone sometimes than a trans woman taking certain medications. So I guess my short answer to that is it's complicated. I think that we all want to see fairness and see folks be able to participate in sports, with the gender that they are, right? But there was a really good quote in one of these articles. I want to tell you, I love this. The governor of Utah, actually, he vetoed a bill that would have been really regressive. Yeah, he vetoed a bill, a sports ban, okay? And he said, he vetoed it because it was, these are all titled to protect women in sports. He cited the potential mental health impact on trans youth, on top of flaws in the legislation. But what he said was, there are so few transgender student athletes in the state to begin with. He said, and here in Utah, there were only 4 kids who fell into this category at this time. He said, these are just kids trying to find friends and trying to feel like they're a part of something, and a lot of times, honestly, we find that it's more the parents and the adults that are more upset around these issues than the kids. So anyway, those are my just kind of brief thoughts about that. So, Wendy, I don't know if there's any others I may have missed.
I do have one question that I know that we commonly get here within the Office of State Human Resources in relation to trans transgender issues, and that would be one of the restroom. How would you handle that if there was an issue with the restroom in your workplace? What would you recommend for us, or any policies or laws?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So currently in North Carolina, HB2 was was eliminated, and so that means it's back in the hands of the legislature. Okay, and the legislature has no outstanding law on it right now, so it's kind of back to the way it used to be, right? Kind of back to people just go to the restroom where they want to go to the restroom. I do know, like, if you're building new buildings, the building code has certain requirements around multiple stalls, which I think are is one way that this is kind of kept in check. The other thing, though, I think I would say is look around your buildings, and wherever you do have single stall restrooms, make those gender neutral, okay? Because that's something under state law we are clearly able to do, to make those gender neutral wherever you can, okay? And of course, where you can convert, do that also, okay? And where you're able to accommodate. One thing I didn't hit on, and I know we're at our time, is all the school systems that are dealing with this. There are a lot of cases out there that are saying that high schools have to adapt, and they have to allow, actually, they have to allow folks to, use the restroom or locker room that they identify with. And so a lot of schools are going in and making their locker rooms a little more private anyway. I mean, everyone wants that anyway. Higher stalls, more doors, more curtains, whatever. Just go ahead and make it a more kind of private place for everyone anyway. And that's a way to kind of proactively address some of that.
Definitely appreciate your answer to that question, because a lot of times I know, like you said, once that law got rolled back, it's, kind of no man's land, but at the same time, you're trying to figure out, okay, what do I do to accommodate for that? And those are excellent suggestions. Are there any other questions that we have here in the chat?
I don't think I see any new ones.
Maybe one here. Actually, it was some more feedback. I'm getting a lot of feedback on your presentation, and a lot of people are saying they enjoyed the presentation and want to know if they will be able to get a copy of this presentation. You will be able to receive a copy of today's presentation, and so you will get a copy of it so that you can look back at all of those articles and statistics that were recommended for us to look at and view. So you will have access to all of those articles, statistics, and everything that is available for you to use for a resource when it comes to transgender, any transgender issues that you may be having, or if you just want to become more educated on transgender history or issues. Do you have anything that you would like to say in closing?
Yeah, there's one last thing I wanted to say, and I know I saw some questions around what if you want to follow through on kind of legal issues or when applying or things like that. I want to give one more really good website for information, and that's the National Center for Transgender Equality. They have a really good site on how you know your rights, because even though, as I told you, we're supposed to be covered, sexual orientation and gender identity, under the Civil Rights Act, Title VII. That's employees of 15 or more. So that would be like state of North Carolina and others. It's one thing to say, okay, you shouldn't be discriminated against, but then you kind of still are. So you need to figure out how to go about using the sword of that law. And so I would urge those who feel like they are to go ahead and consult some experts in that field.
I've definitely enjoyed your presentation today, and I would like to say again, we would like to thank you for coming and giving your presentation today. And if you have any other questions after today, just look for my note about the on-demand recording. It will be posted on demand so that you can see this. And I will also send out copies of today's presentation so that you can reference any of the articles and again, statistics that were given today, because there are a lot of up-to-date stats that you gave that a lot of people are very appreciative to have. So I would like to, again, Professor Lavelle, just thank you for coming out today and giving your presentation. And on behalf of the Office of State Human Resources, again, we would like to thank you and thank you for having you here today. If you can hang around, Professor Lavelle, for just a moment, I would like to speak with you. But for everyone else, I would like for you to continue to look into issues concerning the transgender community. And again, please note that this week is Transgender Awareness Week, and next week will be the Transgender Day of Awareness. So please look out for any other types of proclamations or things that may be forthcoming this week. Again, thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.